Good evening and welcome to Psychedelic Healing. I'm your host, Sonia Cotto, nurse anesthesiologist and mental health advocate, here tonight to discuss with you patents and more regarding psychedelics. My guest tonight, Graham Pechenik with Calyx Law, has over a decade of experience obtaining, asserting, and defending some of the country's most valuable patents, representing numerous companies in the agricultural, chemical, pharmaceutical, biotech, and technology industries. He has worked on litigation teams challenging high profile patents in court, including Monsanto's patents on GMO crops, Apple's patents on touchscreen devices, and others like Microsoft and Amgen. He has also worked on several landmark patent cases, both at trial and on appeal. Before focusing on work with cannabis and psychedelic ventures, he represented past clients like Pfizer, DuPont, AOL, Motorola, Google, and many more. His pro bono work experiences include nonprofit incorporation and asylum representation. He was part of a team that represented the governments of several foreign nations in a tax case before the U.S. Supreme Court. Wow, that's actually very impressive. An Oakland, California native and a longtime advocate of cannabis reform, he was involved in the campaign for Proposition 215 in 1996, and his experience in cultivation started from 1997. In college, he chose his science majors after his first experiences with psychedelics inspired deep curiosity about the chemical and neural basis for changes in consciousness. A continued desire to push for the legality of cannabis and psychedelics drove the decision to enter law school with the dream of becoming an advocate for cognitive liberty. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a very fulsome introduction. So I
Oh,
appreciate
yes.
all that background. Yeah.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, very, very full history. My actual, I know in college, your first experience, my question always is, how did you get into psychedelics, really? So we know in college that's pretty much everyone's introduction. So how was that experience for you and how that transformed your decision going into law?
Yeah. Well, I guess lucky enough in a school of mostly science and engineering nerds in a college. I don't know if you're familiar with UC San Diego, but it's also broken down into separate colleges. I think now it's six. There were five when I was there. And the college I was in was even more focused on sort of pre-med and bioengineering. I was bioengineering pre-med when I started. Lucky enough that one of my friends girlfriends was attending art school, so she was our connection to what was, I think, at UC San Diego, a pretty small psychedelic scene that I may not have run across. But yeah, one day my sophomore year was given the opportunity to try mushrooms and did. And I suppose if I had to sort of look back to my kind of historical timeline, I could probably place where I am here today, having this podcast with you very much based on that particular experience. And I was quite familiar with psychedelics. I mean, as you mentioned, I grew up in Oakland. I had pretty liberal parents. My father's an ordained Zen Buddhist, and we had Be Here Now. It's a coffee table book, and a
Aw.
relatively, I think, long shelf of kind of psychedelic related books, Huxley and Carlos Castaneda and things. My mom went to Berkeley in the 60s. And so, I was not unfamiliar with psychedelics, and I was kind of a stoner in high school, which probably also came across a little bit from my background, but I hadn't really had access to them and wasn't, I suppose, searching them out as much as maybe in hindsight I should have. Although I think my sophomore year in college was probably a good time to kind of make that connection because it felt right in terms of sort of maybe maturity for how I was prepared to integrate, I guess, that experience into my life. But yeah, I
Mm.
mean, it was one of, not just in terms of historical kind of importance, but just the importance of it to the time for me. It was, just the most dramatic thing, I think. And I was pretty used to, since I was a cannabis smoker, understanding kind of slightly different changes of consciousness, and I really appreciated them, for listening to music or going out to music or hanging out with friends or going on hikes and things. And so, the enormous change of consciousness I experienced really did just make me feel both like it just opened my eyes to something that I didn't even know was possible, and made me just really curious to learn more about it, and then to find other people who were interested in exploring those states, and who could, I guess, participate in my own exploration of those. And so yeah, it did fairly dramatically change both kind of my scholarly pursuits. So I dropped my pre-med and bioengineering majors, although largely that was, I think, a product too of not being very happy in all the calculus classes I was in, but changed to cognitive science, where there were maybe a kind of small contingent of psychonauts, I suppose one could say, in biochemistry, just because I was inspired very much by two books by Sasha Shulgin, which I came across after, not that long spending time trying to find out more about psychedelics, PCAL and TCAL, and partly I thought it'd be interesting to learn more about the chemistry, which I felt it was useful to have some kind of classwork, and also if you're taking classes, you might as well take ones that are interesting and you think are helpful. But also, having read those books, I didn't really have that many people who I looked up to in terms of like, what do I want to do with my life? I think part of the reason I was a bioengineering major is because there was like one person in my family who I maybe had met once who had invented the blood pressure cuff for infants and was like probably what everybody thought of in my family as like the most successful member of my family. And he had studied bioengineering. And so I was like, well, if you're smart and you can do science, this is kind of like the mentor for you. But I hadn't thought much more about that as far as role models. But yeah, when I read Shulgin's books, seeing that, well, there's this whole kind of other way one can be creative with learning and kind of work on the world and work on oneself, that made me think, well, if I could do anything, being a kind of psychopharmacologist or psychedelic chemist was kind of what I was inspiring to, naively, I suppose, to some degree.
Yeah.
Although maybe if I was 15 or 20 years later, it would have been easier. The professors at the time that I finally kind of worked up the courage to tell that to thought it was a fairly idiotic idea. I think probably not even exaggerating it too much,
Yeah.
and
Up
suggested
until a
maybe
few
I could.
years. Yeah. Up
Yeah,
until a few
yeah,
years ago, it was pretty not okay.
yeah. So largely, I guess, to kind of finish this train of thought off, ended up in law school, thinking maybe I'd do drug policy or cognitive liberty. I learned about a group that was doing some work writing about cognitive liberty, and those things sounded like they were aligned at least with kind of staying in touch with psychedelics. But then, you know, also I suppose naively, once I arrived at law school and was paying my way in New York, realized that wasn't a way of making enough to pay my law school loans off. But having a science major, patent law was what all the firms were making fairly easy offers at the time. The economy was doing well, and yeah, started off by doing pharmaceutical patent law, and ended up here many years, I suppose, later. Much of
Yeah.
that covered by your introduction.
Yeah. Well, it's a roundabout way, but at least you got to your ultimate goal is working with psychedelics and legalizing consciousness, right?
Yeah, I think so. Although I don't think I ever could have expected before law school that I would do patent law in this field. But yeah, I mean, PCAL and TCAL went from being sort of the first books that I was able to really dive into to explore, psychedelics and psychedelic chemistry, to now, I have them as desk references, and use them all the time to, see what's already known about psychedelics from the patent law perspective. So it, I suppose, is an interesting kind of way to come back full
Yeah.
circle, at least to those.
Yeah. Oh no, that's an amazing way. However you get there, and it's all a purpose and it's all the path that you take. Even me, I always get people, why are you doing psychedelics when you could be doing anesthesia? Anesthesia is, oh my gosh, it's so amazing and it's great and the money and all this, but it's in a roundabout way. That's how I got to psychedelics, right? That I work with ketamine. I own a ketamine clinic now, and I get to help so many people. And I would have never known of this, or nor would I have been able to open the clinic had I not had the experience in anesthesia utilizing ketamine, right? So it's like that
Yeah.
transition into that path, and the same with you. It's however we get there. That's how we got there,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
our
and actually
experiences.
spending time at the bench in chemistry lab was always really difficult for me, and sometimes didn't have maybe the enticements, it could have if I really wanted to have pursue a PhD in that. So maybe working as a psychedelic patent lawyer was the best fit for me after all, even though I never could
Oh,
have predicted
exactly.
that.
Exactly. I mean, for me, the idea of doing all the research and the reading and the writing that you do would be very traumatizing and horrible for me, but you love it. It's your calling and your passion. And I think that's where a lot of people, when they struggle with mental health that I treat, it's about finding your passion and your purpose. I mean, if you hated reading,
Hmm.
I mean, come on, law
Yeah,
school would not be a path to take, or
yeah.
writing and all that. So we all have that purpose. So thank you for doing all that you're doing. But let's
Well,
go
it is my
delve.
pleasure.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. I'm very thankful for that because I would definitely not like or enjoy or do to be in that realm whatsoever. But getting into the patent law, I'm so curious now because all the conferences that I'm going to, you see all these biotech companies that they're trying to develop these chemicals or pharmaceutical medications to replicate and patent
Hmm.
something that already exists naturally. How is that even possible?
Yeah, well, some of them do, and certainly many of the sort of first wave of psychedelic companies we're working with or are still working with some of the known compounds. The way sometimes I explain to people how it's still possible to file patents on them is by taking the example of a pharmaceutical drug, just any other type of pharmaceutical drug, an SSRI or something else that people are familiar with. Most pharmaceutical drugs will have dozens or maybe hundreds of patents filed and potentially granted on them. Some of the most well-known drugs may have over 100 granted patents, which means it's not just a patent on the chemical compound itself, the chemical structure
Mm-hmm.
that can be granted, but it can be many, many other categories of things, and each of those categories may have different areas of aspects that can be patented. So, besides just the drug itself, that structure, it can be, different forms of that drug. Probably the best known and kind of the first patents I knew of in this space, and many people have maybe heard about, are like compasses on psilocybin, which of course aren't on psilocybin. The molecular structure itself is a chemical compound because that's something that's known and exists in nature. People have been using it, producing it for many, many decades, hundreds of years, and certainly the mushroom for don't know when the first mushrooms produced psilocybin, but probably certainly it's
Thousands of
prior
years. Yeah.
art, yeah, many many thousands of years.
Yeah.
But they have patents on a crystalline solid form. It's called a polymorph. So that's kind of one example. That's the sort of ultimate drug product if it's in a capsule or a tablet that one might take. But other
So you can
aspects of
patent something like you can make it and change the form to, you said
hmm
crystalline, so a different kind of chemical formation. And then
yeah,
you change
crystalline
it. Okay.
structure, not just a single psilocybin molecule, but billions or however many hundreds of billions of them are
Mhm.
a uh, in a a crystalline, the solid form you would take if you take a psilocybin tablet, along with other formulation ingredients like the excipients, the inactive ingredients. But yeah, so different formulations, like an IV formulation of psilocybin is something that's also been patented. Subcutaneous formulation, so different ways of delivering it,
Okay.
different indications somebody may be diagnosed with that it could be useful for, different ways of treating those patients, identifying those patients, different kind of dosage forms and dosing regimens, and all sorts of other things kind of around the drug itself. So
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, you can probably make an hour-long podcast that I'm sure would be very tedious and boring to just about everybody except for people
Right.
working in the space, just listing
Yeah.
all the different, dozens of patents somebody can get on a
Yeah.
drug. So it's not, to make
Right.
a long story short, it's not just a drug compound, but it's, many other things that make up,
Hmm.
an approved drug product, and how it's used and what's on the label, and, in the field of psychedelics, what's also in the REMS. So
Hmm.
this is
Yeah.
a kind of a contentious area too, and one of a bit of controversy that's probably too much for this podcast, but maybe people are familiar with the REMS itself, risk evaluation mitigation strategies, that the program that lays out how a drug is administered. So when MDMA
Yeah.
or psilocybin, get approved, as hopefully they will, it's not just the drug product itself, but it's the type of therapy and how the therapists are trained,
The
and
protocol and
yeah,
everything.
the protocol, all that goes into the REMS. So that those can be
Hmm.
things that potentially can be protected by patents too.
Okay. Yeah, because I know that's kind of what's kind of limiting and hurting with the esketamine when I have certain clinics that are utilizing that is the REMS, where it's like
Hmm.
it's a one-to-one monitoring. You have to be in the office monitored for 2 full hours, even though for like the IV or intramuscular, somebody can be in and out of the office within 90 minutes, but no,
Hmm.
they're required one-to-one monitoring for 2 full hours.
Oh, wow.
But hey, if insurance is going to cover it, I always tell my patients, however you can afford the ketamine, that's the route that you need to take. Though there is benefit for the racemic. I know, well, I guess my listeners out there, if you're familiar, there is the Janssen's esketamine that is the intranasal that is patented for treatment resistant depression. And which is different. What they did is they took the molecule that has like two different sides. You have a left-handed and right-handed molecule, and they took one molecule, the left hand, and then patent it and put it in an intranasal form, and then insurance can cover it, right? Which is great for those that are insurance dependent. However, there is always a benefit to having both hands, right? Left hand and right hand in its function. And that's what we know with cannabis. When they try to separate the specific cannabinoids separated, we know that combining it together is all of it has its benefit, right? So ketamine IV and intramuscular, and most ketamines are racemic if you have it in a clinic receiving IV. But if you do have insurance, you have the Janssen's ketamine intranasal patent. Sorry, I had to go on that tangent to
No, it's a good tangent, and it's good not to be myself the one who explains what enantiomers are, because
right.
often I have to do that, and I find myself sometimes tripped up. Although I might say it's not always the case necessarily that both enantiomers are beneficial. I think there's a really good counterexample to that, which is thalidomide, which I think a lot of people are familiar with because it caused birth defects and was, I think, never approved in the US, but pulled off the market elsewhere. But actually, I think it's just one enantiomer of the two of thalidomide, and the other one is used successfully now for some other indications and is marketed again. But I think generally maybe the enantiomers of any particular drug, may have to be researched to determine which is better than the other. There's, I think, both MindMed and Atai are looking to do similar to like what Janssen did with esketamine with R-MDMA and just get the R-MDMA enantiomer approved.
Yeah. What I would like to see them develop is those psychedelics being a shorter half-life, like just a shorter duration of action, because it's going to be, once it's legalized, it's going to take, in the office, you could be in the office, 4, 6, 8 hours with a therapist, 2 to 1, 2 therapists or providers to 1 patient. That's a long day.
It's a long time. Yeah, but maybe it's still an open question whether the therapeutic benefit is greater if the length of time is greater. I mean, certainly there's advantages in terms of therapeutic sort of cost, by
in the
minimizing.
process.
Yeah. But maybe a 12-hour, or I mean with Ibogaine, a 2-day, 3-day.
That's right. Ibogaine is even
has an advantage. I don't know if you could do a short-acting Ibogaine, but there's a lot of interesting questions.
They're doing a lot of research, and Dr. Deborah Mash actually is working on a non-psychedelic form of, they obviously, having the psychedelic experience of Ibogaine is very therapeutic and healing, and is definitely a requirement, I feel like, if you're going to do the Ibogaine. But having a psychedelic Ibogaine where you don't have the psychedelic effects, for those that can't, let's say, travel and, have that experience, doing the oral non-psychedelic form would help with that addiction, because we just need it as much as possible. There's so many people we're losing, with that. So that part I like, because not everybody can have the psychedelic effect, or experience. It is very important for those that can, for the healing, because it's all about the mental health. I mean, I feel like every source of illness is mental health related. The start of the addiction,
Yeah, I think so. I think it is one of the most interesting sort of open questions, though, in the field. The maybe most interesting to me, broadest open question around whether the trip itself, the subjective experience, is necessary for those effects, or for the durable effects of taking a psychedelic versus a psychoplastogen or a non-hallucinogenic psychedelic.
Yeah, no, I'll always argue that the psychedelic benefits, or the subjective benefits and the experience, definitely does have a benefit for that. Although I also have the experience with anesthesia that patients do actually feel better, for a few days after surgery when they've received ketamine. I actually have a patient that I'll be starting next week, that her first experience happened to be, and she didn't know it, was under anesthesia. She had surgery, and all of a sudden, for 3 days after surgery, her depression, her very treatment-resistant depression, was gone. And she was so amazed. She actually called them to see what she received. Ketamine was one of the medications that she received. So that's when she talked to her psychiatrist, and they recommended, let's try it and work deeper in that.
Hmm. Very
So it does
interesting.
have the chemical benefit. So when I talk to patients, it's like there is the chemical benefit. Of course, we're going to have the anti-inflammatory effects. We're going to have the chemical rebalancing and all that. And even with the ibogaine, when you're resetting the dopamine receptors and you're having all the chemical reset of the addiction to wake up without that craving, you know, how amazing would that? How many lives could we save, right? However, that second part, the experiential benefit, that is where you can get subjectively into your subconscious mind and really do the deep work along with therapy and all that. So there are both benefits. I definitely am all about having the experiential experience for patients to really get to that space,
Yeah, yeah. Well, I certainly am on your team there. I mean, my entree to the entire space was because of my subjective experiences, so I'm certainly not quick
And
to write them off.
yeah, yeah. And what kind of work are you doing right now are you working a lot more in the cannabis space now, or what kind of psychedelic patents are you working or fighting against right now?
Yeah, well, I do very little still in the cannabis space, mostly just because I think the patents in the psychedelic space tend to be kind of more mission critical for a lot of companies. So it's really fun to be able to work with a startup when they're building their business around patents. But I mean, Calyx Law, the firm that I started, was really for the purpose of working with cannabis companies, and just has happened to kind of evolve into working now primarily with psychedelics. Most of the work we're doing now in psychedelics is around drug discovery, so novel compounds, because I think it's one of the areas that maybe has some of the least tensions. I mean, besides my kind of day job writing patent applications, I do have, I think, certainly a reputation for having challenged, at least kind of on Twitter, maybe the kind of allowance of patents, which I think probably shouldn't have been allowed. I've spent a lot of time thinking about and some time talking about also just the role that patents play in the space overall, and have, I think, some opinions on that potentially could run counter to trying to file patents on just about everything, which I am fortunate that I'm able to work with companies who both are pursuing patents on inventions of work that really is novel, so novel compounds, things that have never before been seen, and also with companies who are trying really hard to see that tension between filing for patents and being able to attract investment and be able to build a successful business in the psychedelic space, but also do it in a way that's respectful of the fact that people who are now working in the psychedelic space and making money aren't the first to work with psychedelics and are we're really standing on the shoulders of many generations of people who have used it in traditional medicine and indigenous medicine and just the underground, and people that have been kind of carrying the torch since Controlled Substances Act in the 70s, and are doing this work even in a kind of a scientific setting since
Mhm.
psychedelics kind of enter at least a kind of Western mainstream. In terms of our own patents are mostly around psychedelic chemistry. So for companies that are looking to bring novel psychedelics through the FDA approval process, similar to the way MAPS is bringing MDMA and Compass and others are bringing psilocybin. Other companies that are much further up behind now in mostly preclinical testing, but looking at things to solve some of the issues like you mentioned with drugs maybe being too long or maybe having too many like off-target effects in different receptors that might have adverse effects in the people who take them or limit the types of people who are able to take
Mhm.
them. So that's primarily our work. Yeah, and
Yeah.
some work's still challenging. I think there's some patents out there that could be potentially problematic for the broader ecosystem. I mean, most of the work that I do as a patent lawyer is certainly is kind of in the medicalization sort of sphere of psychedelics. But I think anybody who's familiar with this space, as I'm sure you know very well, the kind of medicalization sphere is just one sort of small part of or at least one kind of part of the broader ecosystem where there's people working towards decriminalization, which hopefully will happen soon.
Yeah.
Legalization with different efforts, like in the sort of states of the horizon now are furthest along, like in Colorado and Oregon, and other states
Mhm.
hopefully not too far behind it. But patents play very different roles, I think, in those different areas, and patents might be helpful for attracting investment for people that want to bring new drugs through FDA, but for people who are just thinking about like operating a clinic and doing psilocybin services or want to do work with DMT or 5-MeO DMT, to them, potentially they're not looking to file IP and may not,
Mhm.
I think, properly have novel IP to to protect as it is, but maybe concerned about the the IP that others are filing, especially the IP that others might be filing inappropriately, trying to cover things that are not patentable if the patent laws were properly applied or the prior art was properly searchable, but maybe patentable because patent examiners don't always do a very good job. And so, yeah,
Yeah,
that kind
I
of the
had
process is different.
yeah, you said you had mentioned before on a previous conversation about they actually patented DMT vape pens. I mean, how do you even
Hmm.
patent that when it's something that's not even legal?
Yeah, well, I mean, so the question about legality actually is irrelevant to patent examiners.
Hmm.
Basically, anything's patentable as long as it's not a atomic weapon or a human clone, which are really like kind of the only exceptions to things that are patentable. I mean, there's some other kind of non-patentable subject matter, like you can't patent products of nature and abstract ideas. Like, Einstein couldn't have patented E equals MC squared, but those are maybe a little bit more specific kind of exceptions. But there is no exception for anything that's not legal. I mean, the tens of thousands of cannabis-related patents certainly can underscore that, or the many thousands now, certainly over 1,000 of psychedelics-related patents. And how you could
Hmm.
patent it, despite being known, I think is the bigger question with DMT vape pens. I mean, this patent application was only filed in 2019. And when it was filed, I think people probably, maybe they knew of or had used DMT vape pens before then, but also, I mean, it was known to the public too. I mean, there was a double-blind article and an article, and some other, publications and many forum posts on Reddit and elsewhere about how to make them and, how to formulate them and types of pens people were making. And, many of them had been available and, sold, and there's records of that publicly too. And so, these are things that count as what's called prior art. They were things that were known publicly before the patent was filed, but they weren't available to the patent examiner the way the patent examiner does a search. So clearly they were available to the patent examiner because all they had to do was type in DMT vape pen to Google,
Right.
but they didn't type in VMC vape pen to Google. They basically just did a search of the patent literature, so other patent applications and other patents that have been granted, of which this was the first, so there weren't any other ones. And then a particular database just called Chemical Abstracts Plus. So like, is there any peer-reviewed literature from like a scientific reference that was relating to DMT vape pens, which there weren't. So based on that, they thought, well, this must be an invention, and granted it. And it covers not just DMT vape pens, but also 5-MeO DMT vape pens and 2CB vape pens, and it covers them very, very broadly. I mean, basically, any pen for inhalation by vaporization. So basically, any vape pen that includes any of those substances. I mean, there's no specifics around the type of formulation or the type of device. And so, anybody using, making, selling, importing, anything else the patent laws don't allow, those pens potentially is a infringer. And certainly people are doing that. Not to go too far down the weeds here, because sometimes I get a little excited about this in particular, because I think it's just a, really good
Yeah.
example of something where it's pretty clear that there's, the prior art that should have prevented this from being granted. And it's very clear because you can see the public, it's made public what the examiner did. So you can see they spent, 7 minutes looking at these databases and didn't find anything. You can see that they didn't search for DMT or vape pen or look on Google or anything.
Gotta look on
And so,
Google.
yeah, I mean, so I think the kind of negative implication for something like this would be, if at some point in the future, DMT is a natural substance. We already know that like states like Colorado are looking to, reduce and will soon reduce the penalties and potentially allow DMT to be used in facilitated psychedelic services. Maybe in the future, California will allow it, and others where maybe one could
Oh,
use DMT vape pens or 5-MeO DMT vape pens as part of a facilitated psychedelic service. But this person with this patent application or this now granted patent could prevent anybody from doing that or force him to pay license fees to him. And even though he didn't invent
mm,
the vape pen, and potentially what he could even do now, which I think is what's potentially most concerning, at least for people who are, operating kind of in the underground, is you could
Hmm.
find people, figure out people who are using these now or selling these now, and sort of threaten them to take them to court to
Right.
divulge their financial records or force a judge to divulge their financial records, and make life really difficult for people that are doing things that are still federally illegal, basically as blackmail to get them to pay. The sort of average patent troll settlement might be,
Right.
$50,000, $30,000, but still, which is, an enormous amount of money to somebody to pay to make a, basically false allegation that, shouldn't be countenanced go away. But, um, the cost of hiring
So how does
patent
that,
lawyers is,
yeah, so is that
uh,
something that somebody else will have to hire somebody like you to fight it in the
well,
future?
yeah, I mean, there's conversations going around now. I don't, unfortunately, don't have anything I can announce at present, but yeah, I mean, so it's quite expensive to challenge a patent after it's been granted. Just filing the petition itself is almost $50,000. I mean, that's just the fees paid to the patent office, and there can
Wow.
be a lot of lawyers' work involved too, but it's much cheaper than defending, a case in front of a district court. It could be much cheaper than all the individual people who potentially could get sued,
Mhm.
defending themselves, or hiring
Right.
lawyers themselves. Yeah, and I mean, unfortunately, these types of patent troll cases, as they're called, these kind of nuisance settlements that people are forced into, are not that uncommon. I mean, some states like Washington and Oregon have passed laws preventing these types of cases because people found patents which probably shouldn't have been granted on really basic things like barcode scanners and printers and different aspects of things that, like, kind of mom and pop stores might have, and just sent hundreds or thousands even of cease and desist letters to people, saying,
Wow.
you've been using a barcode scanner in your convenience store, and I have this patent on scanning groceries as a barcode scanner. You can pay me $30,000, or I'm going to take you to court. Oftentimes force small businesses to pay that money. So these types of patent troll cases
No.
haven't yet appeared in psychedelics, but I think that's something
Hmm.
that, especially with state legal markets, as they mature, um, or as they open and then mature, it's something to be cautious about.
Mm. Well, I'm very thankful that I know somebody now in the business in the future to reach out to for that. And I'm thankful that you're here and that it exists, because otherwise, I mean, yeah, it to me it's funny that the patents, it's not the issue of that it's an illegal substance, like, oh, it's just DMT, but it's the fact that it's a vape pen and it was already around.
Hmm.
So yeah, and that's what worries me too about the other medications. But I guess I'm sure the pharmaceutical companies and all the bigger companies, they're going to actually make these compounds different formulation, actually make it, you know, patentable
Yeah.
for the
Yeah,
future.
and I might be a little less concerned about some of the pharmaceutical companies just because they have, teams of lawyers and much deeper
Yeah.
pockets than,
So they
somebody
know.
who wants to start a psilocybin clinic or a 5-MeO DMT,
Hmm.
um, clinic.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think the clinics are going to be looking to form their own patents and all that, but be able to utilize the medicine to help people. I would hate to, because that's the other thing too. Are you familiar with MAPS? I hear that they are going to have the license to distribute the MDMA once it becomes legalized.
Mm.
Um, so then it's going to be like $1,500 per pill for dose. Is that true? Like, to
Well,
me,
I mean, I can't speak to the pricing. I mean, I imagine it's going to be expensive, although I imagine
yeah,
the cost of the MDMA, like, drug product, is, whatever it is, still a small portion of the overall MDMA assisted therapy, which is,
right.
I mean, I'm sure it'll be at some point hopefully covered at least partially by insurance, but when it's not, I mean, I imagine that
Mm,
cost is going to put it out of reach of nearly everyone if it's
yeah.
$20,000 or $15,000 or $30,000. But yeah, I mean, you also raised a really good point. I mean, there's something which maybe you've heard about, but there's something called bifurcated scheduling. So, MDMA now is on Schedule 1, and part of the reason it's on Schedule 1 is because it has no medical use. Well, obviously, if it gets FDA approved, that's pretty good evidence that it has medical use.
Yeah.
And indeed, the DEA has 90 days to down schedule it or deschedule it if it gets approved, which presumably then they will, putting it on Schedule 2 or 3, I imagine.
Mhm.
Um, but the only thing that gets descheduled or downscheduled is MDMA, the specific drug product that MAPS has one approval for. Everybody's best guess.
Hmm.
The other drugs that have been scheduled, like THC and CBD with Epidiolex and GHB with Xyrem, and all of those have been descheduled or rescheduled. Only the approved drug product, but have remained on Schedule One otherwise. So, THC is still a Schedule One drug, and GHB is still Schedule One drug, I believe. But the drug products, I mean, Epidiolex um, and the approved dronabinol, THC, are
Hmm.
no longer Schedule One. So I think the same thing would happen with psilocybin and MDMA. So all that, just very long way of saying MDMA itself is not going to be off Schedule One, presumably, but only MAPS is MDMA. So it's not gonna
Mm.
mean people
So it's
can
not like,
start MDMA, therapy clinics and use another form of MDMA, not participating in the FDA, whatever the REMS. Go back to REMS,
mm. So it'll be the
requires.
specific maps, and that's why. Okay. Because I'm
Yeah,
like, can't, because I'm sure you can get it in the underground for God dollars compared to,
yeah. I mean, that'll
but the
probably
quality, you don't know what's inside. You never know,
true.
do no
Yeah,
harm.
yeah. Well, that's a whole nother story. I'm sure you can have a whole podcast on
Oh,
those
yes.
policy questions too. But yeah, I mean, even if
Yeah.
it's not MAPS as MDMA, I still think there should be certainly ways to identify whether the MDMA people are getting is pure and is in
Yeah.
fact MDMA.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of companies out there as well now that are doing testing,
Hmm.
right? Where they're testing the psilocybin, just like they are with the cannabis. They're testing you know, what is inside, what particles, if there is anything inside
Hmm.
of it, right? Because now you have, I mean, it's actually dangerous. So I always recommend people to really be very, very careful because now you can see it on Instagram. You can get so many different things, even just on Instagram,
Mm. Yeah,
and you don't know what's inside. You just have to be very, very careful. Trust the source,
yeah,
especially now that it's becoming more mainstream. You just don't know.
yeah. Well, I mean, the good thing about mushrooms is they're fairly easy to grow at home. Um,
Yes.
but yeah, any kind of white powders, it's pretty difficult to know what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've actually, even with cannabis, there's been fentanyl being
Mm,
laced in cannabis and
mm,
killing people. That's straight murder. Like why anybody would lace cannabis with that. It's very sad. So everyone has to be careful now in any type
yeah.
of psychedelic or anything that's out there that's not regulated or tested. But there are some safety testing kits. So I'm actually wanting to interview somebody in that area in
Mm,
that realm on on safety and how to test your meds before you're gonna utilize them to really know what's inside. So that's actually the good part about, with maps, you know what's inside. With now that cannabis, we have the medical and recreational, these dispensaries, you can go safely and know that it's safe and it's not going to be laced with
mm,
fentanyl, right? As opposed to going to any drug dealer on the street, you can go and get real plant medicine safe and know exactly what's inside. Um, and that's what you'll know with the psilocybin in the future too. So, and all the
yeah,
other
yeah. And I'm
medications.
sure there'll be people who are willing to pay more to be able to have that trust in the
Hmm.
psilocybin or MDMA that
Yeah.
they're getting from, yeah,
Yeah.
FDA approved products.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Graham, for coming in and talking to me about patent law. That, I mean, it seemed at first I was like, how exciting can I make patent law? But actually, it was a really amazing conversation. I
Hmm.
really enjoyed it so much.
Well,
So,
I'm glad for that. Yeah, well, thank you for for inviting me to share a little bit about patent law. I think it was probably mostly the more interesting bit. So I'm glad we were able to cut here because everything else I'd have to say, I'm sure, is on a steep downhill curve
right.
of descending on interest. But yeah, those are the highlights.
Right. Oh, no. Best highlights, perfect conversations. But I'm sure I will definitely reach out to you more as stuff comes in, and I definitely how that plays out, and definitely want to know about the different patents that you're working on or arguing for or against. So I look
Yeah,
forward to
well,
that.
always happy to talk more, and I think there'll be lots of interesting things. I hope in the future because yeah, it's still early days. There's still a lot of patents that are unpublished because they take a year and a half to publish. So we're only seeing what's already a year and a half old, and there haven't been any real litigations yet So that's when, the sparks will really fly, and hopefully some follow-up that'll be as interesting to report on.
Nice. Well, if I think of an invention to patent, I'll be giving you a
Yeah,
call.
well, send you my virtual business card.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Graham. And thank you, everyone out there, for joining us for this week's dose of psychedelic healing. Have a beautiful night.